afternoon, friends. I'll take applause. Good afternoon, and thanks so much for being here. I'm Ian Rye, and it's my privilege to welcome you to a little inside peek at the Garden of Alice. This has been an extraordinary time for each and every one of you, and I want to take a moment as we slowly return to the Royal Theatre to thank you for everything you've done to take care of yourselves, to take care of family and friends and community and the arts community too. We had a remarkable premiere of The Garden of Alice last night here at the Royal, and I'm just thrilled that we're able to finally present our first large-scale experiment in filmmaking with a wonderful work of music and a remarkable team of artists and interpreters and creative artists. It's been a long wait for us as we've been testing our skills in testing the art form in this transition to film, and it's been so rewarding, and I know you'll enjoy hearing more about the work today. Before I introduce our first guest, I want to thank, of course, each and every one of you. I want to thank our season sponsors, BMO and the Chateau Victoria, a national and international and local firm two firms who, quite frankly, have stewarded the arts, opera, and Pacific Opera for so many years that the relationship is that of family. I also want to make sure you guys know about what's coming up at the opera. It has been a long wait for live performance, and thank you for waiting. We all were supposed to be here seeing Carmen tonight, and as you know, we won't be doing that. However, March 11th is the live premiere of Bon Appetit and the Italian Lesson at the Bauman Center. This work, you may have seen a film interpretation of it that we produced a year ago. This is a live presentation by one of British Columbia's most extraordinary interpretive artists, mezzo-soprano Megan Latham. And I just really encourage you to come. We have a fabulous setup at the Bauman Center. It's a cabaret setup, and with an intimate kind of piece. This is the perfect environment to see this kind of chamber opera. And of course, we're looking forward to Don Giovanni and the release of another film project in the month of April called For a Look or a Touch. And we know you'll join us here at the Royal Theatre for those extraordinary works. I want to take this moment to gather in our thanks and our appreciation for our host this afternoon, somebody who, as we know, has curated the arts in this community and the opera in this community so well that he's a household name in every household in Greater Victoria. So please join me in welcoming to the stage, perhaps a little rusty like I am at public speaking. It's been a long time. Please welcome Robert Holliston.
Hello, everybody. Wonderful to see you all again here live in the Royal Theatre. Thanks for being here. And we're just going to talk about and introduce this fantastic filmed project. POV had to think of a lot of ways to keep itself occupied during the COVID pandemic and the shutdown and lockdown and isolation and quarantining and all those other words we didn't think we'd use for 2 years. And among the things that POV did was go into the movie business. And so we're going to discuss today a little bit about The Garden of Alice. And actually, I brought you some clips that are a little bit longer than the ones that briefly passed by on the video you just watched. This is an extraordinary work, and it was composed by Elizabeth Raum in 1984 and received its premiere in 1985. And Elizabeth was both the librettist and the composer. And it's a little bit, it's prescient. It is not irrelevant, the events that are depicted in this work. It wasn't in 1984, and it certainly isn't today. And perhaps neither are the events portrayed in the Lewis Carroll book. There have been several versions. It's evolved over the years, particularly in terms of the way the story wraps itself up, as Elizabeth will talk to you about a little bit later, and also in terms of its accompaniment. So what you're going to hear today was first envisioned by a company in New York City in around 2018, 2019, and that was to expand the instrumental accompaniment to a sextet. And unfortunately, COVID prevented that production from going forward, but Pacific Opera benefited from it. And we'll also hear from somebody about the extraordinary physical challenges and rewards of making a film at the Bauman Center. Now, this took place, of course, it began in November 2020. And I'm thinking, and I have been thinking for 2 years, how many other small companies in cities this size went into COVID with the last two productions being Flight by Jonathan Dove and The Complete Trittico by Puccini? Did anybody remember those productions? Good. I've been thinking of them with such, well, elation, actually. That at least if we had to take a hiatus, we certainly went out on a high. So the overall concept of this piece, as you'll see, has evolved a little bit. We have our leading lady here today, Tracy Dahl, and Tracy is eternally youthful, but 35 years is 35 years, so they decided to make a different concept. The young Alice has become an older lady, I would say maybe 31, 32, and she's now in the hospital and is dealing with an unnamed infirmity. And so it's a bit of a flashback, or it's a bit of what's happening in her imagination right at that very moment. And so what you're going to see is the various different people who work around hospitals become the various different, not quite benign creatures that populate the story of Alice as she looks for her happiness and peace in the garden. I'm thinking that they seem to be quite benign people in the hospital too, but from the point of view of somebody lying in a hospital bed, I don't know how many people ever think that the nurses and doctors hovering around them are really all that harmless. In any case, we'll talk a little bit about that, but I'd like to show you this small handful of excerpts. And the first one has Alice, freed by her imagination from the constraints of her hospital bed, coming into contact with, now I'm going to ask this question, because I don't think I'm the only person in the room who remembers the late 1960s. Does anyone remember a song called White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane? Okay, so you do remember that reference to the hookah-smoking caterpillar. So I knew there'd be a couple of old 60s rock fans in the audience other than just me. So we're going to meet the hookah-smoking caterpillar, who's played by Peter Monahan. And I just wanted to introduce him because he will be appearing with us in Don Giovanni as Mazzetto. So this is the first excerpt, Alice meets the hookah-smoking caterpillar.
Explain myself because I'm not me, don't you see?
I don't see.
But I can't be more clear. I can't understand it. So many sizes today is quite confusing. What can I do? Where can I go? How can I find out what I should know? This is a strange place. This is a wondrous place. Wonderland it
butterfly? Not a bit.
Well, then you're different. But it's strange for me.
You? Who are you?
I think you ought to tell me who you are first.
Why?
I'm leaving.
Come back.
I have something to say to you.
Keep your temper.
Is that all?
No.
So that is a fantastic little excerpt. And it reminds us, I perhaps shouldn't assume we've all read Alice in Wonderland, but it reminds us Alice is sometimes tall and sometimes tiny. And again, the line from White Rabbit, one pill makes you smaller, the other makes you tall. And also, I love the way that the instruments are treated soloistically, but also as an ensemble. And I love the underpinning of that percussion. That's awesome. And percussion was a potent part of the very, very first version of the accompaniment for The Garden of Alice. So the next excerpt shows us at the tea party. And again, this is a very famous passage in the book where Alice keeps being offered more of something when she hasn't been offered any of it yet. So it's amusing and also a little bit off-putting. And the guests at the tea party that we meet are the Mad Hatter, who's played by Peter McGillivray, the Mad Hare, who's played by Caden Forsberg, and the Dormouse, who's at first napping, who's played by Sarah Shabas. And we'll have a very, very short introduction, not quite their entire parts, almost, to the molasses-eating sisters. So this is the second excerpt, The Tea Party with the Mad Hatter and the Mad Hare.
Why, thank you, Mr. Hare. You're welcome, Mr. Hatter.
Why, there's plenty of room.
Have some wine.
I don't see any wine.
There isn't any.
Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it.
Well, it wasn't very civil of you to come here without being asked.
Do you know the song?
Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder why you're at.
Oh, I've heard something like it.
It goes on, you know.
Up above the world so high, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder why you're at.
Why, that's a song I used to sing. I know it.
Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, oh, how I wonder what you're at. Up above the world so high, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, oh, how I wonder what you're at.
Oh, I say, you have the words wrong.
Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at. Twinkle, 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 twinkle.
Look, the mouse is awake.
Wake up, Dormouse.
Tell us a story, Dormouse.
Oh, yes, please do.
And be quick about it, or you'll be asleep before it's done.
Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters, and they lived at the bottom of a well, and their names were Ellie
and Lucy and
If you
Tilly
please,
and
what did they eat there?
molasses.
But they would have been sick.
They were.
Seeing such people as Simran Clare, Megan Latham, and Nolan Kaler just heads on a platter was not an unsatisfying thing to contemplate. Just fun to look at. So the next excerpt is when Alice finally finds her way into the garden that she's been admiring and in love with since she first caught a glimpse of it when, because her door was too small to get through, she couldn't have any access to it. And this is a terrific example of beautiful writing for the voice, expressing exactly what the text indicates, and also how, when we have a passage that's that gloriously written, it is handled by a singer of the stature of Tracy Dahl. So this is one of my favorite passages in the whole piece for every single reason that one has favorite passages in an opera. So enjoy Tracy Dahl in the Garden.
But I do wish to find my way into the garden. It's so lovely and seems so very happy. And I know that a place so beautiful must be filled with love and filled with joy, for such beauty must all ill destroy. How can I get into the garden? How can I get into the garden?
There's a tree with a door. There's a tree with a door. There's a tree with a door.
There's a tree with a door leading through it. Oh, at last I'm in the garden. It's been so long I've searched for it. It's as beautiful as I imagined it. The garden, such a wonderful sight. Could heaven be so lovely, be so peaceful as this place? Such peace and happiness here I feel in the garden. I shall leave behind whatever makes me sad and then I'd gather all the joy and love and laughter and bring them through. See how the sun is shining. Let me stay here forever.
And finally, another humorous excerpt from the piece. Three of our singers, two of whom you've already, no, all three of you whom we've already met, the two Peters and Caden, play cards number 2, 5, and 7, who are constantly being terrified by the Queen of Hearts, who is played by Megan Latham. And the Queen of Hearts, of course, very famously keeps on hollering out, "Off with her head, off with his head, off with their heads." I think in the book she always has her pronouns agree with the verb. And so we're going to watch this Lobster Quadrille, and this gives you an idea of the ensemble at its peak and of the humor of the piece. And also, can you believe all this was filmed in the Bauman Center? Have you all been to the Bauman Center? That's the wonder of technology and of imagination joining hands. And I also will ask this, I won't ask, I'll assume that some of you at least have been to Inside Opera in the old days when we were up at UVic, and we would generally have people come in and sing for you, people from the cast. But we decided to show some clips from the film because after all, that is what you will be seeing. So please enjoy this final clip, the Lobster Quadrille from The Garden of Alice.
Walk a little faster, said the whiting to the snail. There's a porpoise close behind, and he's treading on my tail. See how eagerly the lobsters and the turtles all advance. They are waiting on the shingle. Will you come and join the dance?
Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you join the dance?
What matters how far we go, his scaly friend replied. There's another shore, you know, upon the other side. The farther off from England, the nearer is to France. Then turn not, pale beloved snail, but come and join the dance.
Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you, won't you join the dance? Will you, won't you, will you join the dance?
We didn't hear any singing from the White Rabbit, but you will hear plenty when you see the film. And I'll just mention that's played by Justin Welch, who will also be joining us in the cast of Don Giovanni. Elizabeth Raum was already a very accomplished professional oboist, and as she said, she stumbled into composition at the age of 35, and she didn't realize really fully that that was even something women did. After all the composers I'd ever heard of, she said, were men. I think we've moved a little bit onward since then, and thanks to you, among others. The very first composition Elizabeth completed was an opera called The Final Bid, for which she was actually supposed to be only the librettist. But the composer, Tom Schudel, who was supposed to be her collaborator, couldn't find the time to write the score, so he suggested that she do it. And so she switched hats and found a natural fit for herself. Subsequently, she's written more than 80 pieces, 80 chamber pieces, including a large output for brass instruments. And she's received multiple awards, and we're thrilled to have her with us today to chat a little bit about her work. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Elizabeth Raum. So just make yourself at home in any chair that has a mic. Thank you. And of course, the role of Alice was created by Tracy Dahl. More or less at the start of her career, shortly before she rose to international fame as one of the leading colorateurs of our time. Many of you will remember her performances as Maria Stuarda and Lucia di Lammermoor, and she's performed at the Metropolitan, at La Scala, all across North America, and including some contemporary works such as The Ghosts of Versailles. And most recently, Timothy Vernon came back from Santa Fe to report that she had a stunning success and gave a great performance as Mozart's Despina in Così fan tutte. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Tracy Dahl. Now, one of the leading figures in Canadian opera has got to be our artistic director, Timothy Vernon. I'm fond of saying in my presentations in the lobby that if it weren't for Timothy Vernon, we wouldn't have done 2 Janaceks, 4 Strausses, 5 Brittens, or 6 Brittens, and any number of other outstanding works. He's always been a champion for not only contemporary works, but masterpieces that are not always presented in houses. So he has a lot to say about how this got up and running. So please join me in welcoming to the stage our own artistic director, Maestro Timothy Vernon. Now I'm going to join them. It's been 2 years, so I'm quite nervous about actually interviewing people. It used to come more easily, so I wrote some questions down. So Elizabeth, you and I did have a conversation, some of our guests may have watched it, that was a Zoom interview, and you talked a great deal about some of the influences that were behind this piece, and I'd like to ask you just a couple of questions about that. The first of all, what is it like being your own librettist?
It's much better than any other. If you can do it, I highly recommend it. And then, you know, one of the things is this particular opera started out to be a children's opera. And as I got going into it, various things happening in my life at the university, it turned it around. It changed it. It influenced the opera, and it took on a life of its own. If I had had a librettist, I couldn't have changed it. I would have had to stick to what he had. Or if he changed his mind, I would have had to stick to what he wanted. So it's much better to write your own libretto.
That's good to hear. And she's just invited anyone who wants to apply to do those dual roles, just let us know. Now, also, the original version of Alice, you said, was somewhat darker. It strikes me still as a somewhat dark piece, a suggestive piece.
It was much darker. In fact, Tracy, do you remember you didn't want to sing the end that I had originally? She didn't want to. I had her taken off in a straitjacket, and she says, "I'm not going to do this every night for 2 weeks." So I had the Jack of Hearts. The Jack of Hearts was found guilty, and she saves him by waking up. But she doesn't wake up. The characters don't go away. So the Jack of Hearts get between her and the characters and protect her. And then you ran off stage. And in other words, he represented reason. And because she had defended reason, he saved her. So there was a deep meaning to all of this. But then when Glynis asked me to redo it, the end, because she wanted it to be hopeful. In this situation we're in right now, I think it's better to be hopeful. And I thought the end gave a lot of hope.
Absolutely. And so, Tracy, it has been some 35 years or so since you first sang this role. What's it like coming back after all this time?
Very different.
Pardon me?
Very different.
Yeah.
Very different. I think the perspective of when I played Alice the first time was I was young enough to play Alice maybe perhaps as somebody who would have been a young teenager, or, you know, I could do that. When Timothy and Glynis and I had our phone meeting and they brought up this work, I was like, oh, they can't be serious. They want to do a film and they want me to be Alice? That's just not going to happen. You can't get rid of all these wrinkles. So, but they had a new approach, and so they wanted me to be my own age, and no, not 35, but my own age, and someone who was in hospital and whose hallucinations because of the drugs she was on took her on this trip that was kind of activated and motivated by a book that she's given in the hospital while she's there by herself to read. And so she gets to Alice, the Garden of Alice, and starts to read it, and then her mind, when she's on the drugs, goes to all these places. So it was very, very different. Lots of changes in line readings and how the different frustration for an adult where things don't make sense, and for a child, and how very upsetting it is actually at the end of the piece when she's trying to make sense of it all. So I think it really felt quite different. It really did.
But effective in a different way. Now, Timothy, I read that you came up with a list of no fewer than 36 ideas as to what the company might do during COVID. And of course, at a time when we had no idea how long it would last. I remember Timothy and I Zoom almost every week, just to sort of, at the end of the week on Saturday evenings. And you did talk to me about some of the other ones, but it did end up centering on this. So can you tell me a little bit about what it was like preparing this rather than an opera? Because I'm just going to say one of the things I'd like Timothy to talk about is the whole issue of pre-recording the score with the singers and instrumentalists. And then I'm sure both of you have something to say about that too. And then having to film it with that as the background.
Well, Robert, you know, we all hate obvious lip syncing. And we've seen it when singers are on screen and they're singing a high C and they're doing this. It just isn't convincing, certainly not for an opera lover. Part of the athleticism of singing is physicality. I mean, that's what's appealing. You know, it's an effort, and you like to reward that effort, especially when such beautiful sounds come out. So I was determined to find a way that we didn't get this all the way through, because the effort of singing involves the whole body. And I came up with a solution which may or may not have worked for our performers, but everybody was completely cooperative in the end. So what we did was, as you mentioned, we taped the entire score in the studio, such that we were sure we had at least a clean tape. Clean, by which I mean not too much intonation problems, reasonably clear ensemble, you know, continuity, blah, blah, blah. And then the singers were given this tape to get used to hearing themselves and asked, when we came to the filming, to sing back to their own tape, so that they were singing as they were being filmed. But the ambiguities and the split focus in terms of singing and acting and all the things that were required, and filming is much more specific than here on stage, where there's a certain amount of leeway and forgiveness. The camera's right there. We all know the camera doesn't lie. So I wanted to be sure that we had something secure, musically secure, as a basis for taping it. And of course it was hard. You know, I don't think any of our singers had ever done this exactly this way, but all of them were terrific in getting into it. And I think, as you've seen, I don't know, but I certainly, watching last night, felt convinced that we had singers singing. And that's important. I had to think I just wanted to, because you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, the idea of the ending you had with the straitjacket. And that came a few sentences after you said it was for children. So I thought, well, it's maybe more Roald Dahl than Lewis Carroll. I don't know. If you really thought straitjacket for children. Well.
What's that?
Well, I think that it started off as a children's opera, but when it started going off on its little tangent, that's when you had your own creative ideas, and it went to that land of the straitjacket.
Oh, for sure. For anyone that is... the original ended with the White Rabbit coming back in and saying, hop, hop, which is the end of Wozzeck, where the little boy is playing on his hobby horse, and the kids come in and they say, hey, your father has killed your mother. something like that.
Yeah.
And that was, it was, by the time I got to the end of Garden of Alice, it was a schizophrenic Kafka-esque horror story. And that's the beauty of being a librettist, because then when I changed it, I rewrote it for Tracy, I could do anything I wanted with it. So I did. I changed quite a bit of it. I wrote about 3 minutes in the beginning to get you into the hospital. and then, of course, changed the end to get you, well, you never got out of the hospital, but it was a hopeful ending.
You know, when you think about it, it does seem like like Wozzeck is not the first opera that comes to my mind when I think of introducing opera to children. That said, though, when you think of the shock-headed Peter stories and the Grimm fairy tales, some of them are pretty.
Hansel and Gretel, there's a fun one.
Yeah,
they had an effect on me as a child.
Well, you're right about the grimness, but I also think writing for children opens up a kind of backward look at musical idiom. Because you're right, you don't think of children when you think of Wozzeck. You don't think of children when you think of the entire Viennese school or any of the subsequent modernists, you know, and they haven't written for children. The people before it, Bach, Schumann, they wrote for children. Benjamin Britten wrote a lot for children. But these, you know, self-important movers of musical history did not. And it's kind of interesting that writing for children, wouldn't you say, opens the door to a much broader idiom than if you were trying to be now and contemporary and all of those
I
things.
agree.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of other things I'd like to ask. Elizabeth, when we had our little our meeting, you mentioned, well, the coincidence that you composed this in 1984, because it does have and continue to have relevance to things that are going on in our society to this very day, I think. Maybe very much this very day.
Well, the trial actually is where it all culminates. That it's not what you say, but how you say it, and that's becoming so prevalent today. Everything that happened in the trial, and what do you know about this case? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Enter that as evidence. It's unfortunate, but it just seems like that's becoming more a reality.
Mm-hmm. And someone is pronounced guilty without having had any evidence.
Yeah.
So it's thought-provoking on many levels.
It is, regard. Yeah.
So Tracy, I mentioned The Ghost of Versailles, and you've been in any number of other new pieces, but also you have a great deal of experience, Mozart, Donizetti, Bellini. How does it, or is it in any way different learning a brand new role that no one's ever sung before, and how do you like it?
Well, when you're learning something that has never been done before, there is no historical reference. So it is yours to put your mark on. Everything should be, whether it's Donizetti or Mozart, you should find your own way of expressing that and finding a way to express your character with the cooperation of your team. But when you are exploring something new that hasn't been done before, you are freed. We quite find, I'm also a music educator, and we find quite often that students do much, much better when in their new music, because they aren't trying to sing like the famous voices of the past that they've heard do whatever that music cycle is. So when they're doing something that's never been done before, all of a sudden there's a creative liberty that happens with that. So I think there is that, but there also is, how the heck do I count this? I think the most difficult score, and it wasn't Ghost of Versailles, but was actually Peter Ash's The Golden Ticket, which is a fantastic work based on the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And I just looked at it and went, 7/16? What? How am I supposed to count that? And it was a challenge, and so sometimes those are the challenges. Sometimes it's atonal. Sometimes it's just stratospheric. John Adams is stratospheric. Ghosts was stratospheric. So then you have to work out the technical aspects of it.
Timothy's actually has a good response to questions from orchestra members who say, which recording of the opera that we're about to do you recommend I listen to? And he says, either all of them or none of them. So you get the broad picture, you just go to the principal source. And I've bored it for all my students. Thanks very much. I don't always credit you, I have to admit, but sometimes I do. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because Glynis can't be here, and you wrote about it, and this will have involved both of you too, is the whole process of creating this on film with our resources, which are not unlimited. And Glynis said it was kind of like a wonderland, making the film, more like the trial sequence than the garden, I'm afraid. So, can you tell us what it was like a little bit? Because we can't always imagine.
Well, of course, the physicality of filming. I mean, it's not something you can do in a telephone booth. Not that you can do opera, although there has been opera staged in telephone booths, I've read about. It takes space, because you have to create the stage and the space for the actors and singers, but then there has to be space for the cameras who are going to move. They're all going to move around at some point. Then you've got lighting, which is more detailed, more immediate, and closer, obviously, than in the theater. So the challenges, and then the creation of a green screen, that screen onto which you can portray, movement and so on with the character in the foreground, and sort of adding the animation and those other things later on, which I think Emily Cooper did so brilliantly for this little film. So yeah, and the Bauman, much as we're proud of it and like to go into it, it's not big. It's not. It's a small space for production. It's even small for actually rehearsing a full-staged opera. But it's a lovely space, and we've come to be very fond of it, and it's had many, many, many uses. But those were some of the restrictions. And of course, if we'd had 3-4 more cameras, you get more detailed angles and closer shots and so on. We worked with, I think, 4 or 5, was that right?
There were 3 cameras.
3?
3 cameras.
Ooh.
Actually, we actually used the church across the street.
Yeah.
And artists that weren't in scenes had to go there because we were only allowed so many people in the room at a time.
At the same time.
So that if we had all of the cast in the room, then some of the crew had to leave. So we were constantly keeping track of how many people were in the room. I would say there were a few of us who were there all the time. I was one of them. Didn't get to leave. And I just wanted to say, too, because when we were watching here today, there was some trouble with synchronicity of the filming and the sound. That did not happen last night. They put it together perfectly, or as well as we could all manage. But it was an art form to get people to get the makeup on for the next scene, remove scene. We didn't film it in order. It's probably, I don't know if you're asking me that later, but that was definitely the most difficult part for me as an actress, was we didn't go in order of the piece. We did all the hospital scenes in one place. We were jumping around, so I had to pull out emotions out of nowhere and know, what scene did I just come from? Where am I going now? While they reset scenes, I sat on the side with my iPhone and my earphones in, listening to the next set of music, making sure I knew exactly where my consonants happened, how they were going to be formed, so I could breathe that and make it happen as organically as possible so we wouldn't have to do too many takes. It was intense. There wasn't downtime. Like if I was off, it was not down, even though they may have been relighting or anything like that. It was intense.
Tracy's just used the word consonants. And I just want to say, one of the things I love about her singing is the incredible clarity in the text. The lines are beautiful, the tone is beautiful. There's a sheen over every arching melody. It's fantastic, but every single syllable of every word communicates itself. She's got this amazing and wonderful facility to bring it forward and make us hear all those details. I also just wanted to say, in connection with your wonderful pedagogical work, I was a bit surprised, let's say, to hear you say that young singers have to be discouraged from copying the voices of the past. My experience has been, I've had to write down the name Fischer-Dieskau a few times for young singers who've never heard of him.
I
Same
think
with Callas.
that would be a misinterpretation of what I said. I wouldn't say you shouldn't listen to the singers of the past. I think that that's important, and I think there's a lot to be learned. And so when you were saying earlier, listen to all of the recordings or none of the recordings, to my students, I say, listen to the slowest recording, listen to the fastest recording, and know that you can do it as slow as a conductor will give it to you or as fast as you might see it. So I fall in that category. I just think that the freedom of singing something that hasn't been done before is an oral freedom.
Of course.
Because if you're trying to live up to the reputation of a Joan Sutherland, I'm not going to get to that bar, but I think it's important to know what that bar is. But I think if we hold ourselves up to that, sometimes it's it's an unattainable gain. So.
Actually, I'm going to throw this in. I'm not here as a piano teacher, but I do have lots of students, and one of the most irritating things that I hear is, I ask if you've ever listened to this piece. And they say, oh yes, I went on YouTube. And so who was playing? I don't know. So I don't know if it was Arthur Rubinstein or somebody who was just did a grade 8 exam or grade 10 exam. So I try to encourage them to get to know their heritage, because it is what it is. We have a huge heritage.
It's amazing what's available. That's the
It
thing.
is,
You can hear, umpteen versions of whatever you choose to listen to. But I think that also contributes to kind of a homogenization or a blend in the imagination. And you're right, people don't even notice who's actually making this happen. And that individuality, that thing that rests with the interpreter, that thing that makes the interpreter essential to the preservation of musical values, that thing on which the composer depends and puts his trust in when he lays down his pen or goes to the grave. He knows, trusts that there will be people who will bring their individuality to bear, will understand what he wants, and get as close as they can. I find, and I'm sounding like an old curmudgeon, I've always been a curmudgeon. I'm
yeah,
just
you
older
have.
now.
I've known you for a long time.
But I find that's eroding somehow.
Well,
Do you?
yes. However, I don't think it's necessary just because people don't listen to enough recordings or they listen to too many. We could probably spend the whole rest of the afternoon talking about the pros and cons of competitions and coaches who are about winning contests rather than learning the music. And we'd all be right. That's the thing. You've got a good 4 people up here. But that's an interesting point of view to ask a composer. What degree of freedom do you welcome in someone who's interpreting one of your works?
What did you just ask me?
What degree of freedom, or how do you think about the freedom an interpreter will bring
I'm glad
to?
you asked me that. I feel that after I've written a piece, I give it to the performer, and it's theirs. They have to have their own interpretation. They're creators as much as I am. Because, you write a piece and it can be played so many ways. Just look at Beethoven. Not that I'm comparing myself to Beethoven, but how many ways have his symphonies been done? And in fact, these days, it's funny, you see the name of the conductor on his symphonies, on the records. You don't see Beethoven. So the interpretation, for me, is of utmost importance.
That's great to hear. And it's liberating, I think, for people to hear that. Yep. Now, I want to ask one final question for all 3 of you. I read this twice, that 2.5 days of filming. How was that possible? Okay, that was the most eloquent answer.
Not much sleep.
Well, go ahead.
It was a lot of planning. And sometimes our planning didn't work out. Sometimes we went longer than we thought. So then it became important that other parts of that day went very, very smoothly so that we didn't repeat some things, For example, what you didn't see in the molasses scene, the girls who come up from underneath the tables, once that got shot, it was only shot once because there was live food that got flung around the room, so we had only one shot at it. That was it. And sometimes we were able to do things in one shots. There were always multiple shots. We knew exactly what was coming. We were given an agenda. We knew what we had to accomplish. We knew quite early on, I think maybe halfway through the first day, that we were going to need that second half day, that there was no way we were going to do it in 2, that we were going to need that extra time because there was so much that had to happen between changing the scenes, setting them up, changing the lighting, costumes, makeup, all of those things that had to happen. But it was very, very well managed by our stage managers. They kept us on time. They knew what we needed to do. They knew where we needed to go. So it was a lot of organizational skill and focus. I don't honestly know when I've had to focus that hard in my life. Like if you're on the stage for an opera, you're focused for that evening, you're focused probably partway through your day. But this was 2.5 days of, this is all, you were breathing this all the time and you didn't kind of get a break. So it was intense. There's no other way to describe it.
I think some of the success in getting that in under the really restricted time frame goes to Glynis and to David, our camera director, because they were so quick on the draw when it came to having to repeat, having to shift, having to make a small nuance maybe before the big changes of moving the whole set and moving all the cameras. There would be these little takes. I thought it was terrific, and I loved the way our Glynis, whom we all know and love, discovered film. I think it was terrific. By the end of that 2.5 days, she'd added to her vocabulary things like camera ready or cut, which are not things you usually lose in the opera rehearsal. And at the very end even, she had to be encouraged. I think it was David who said, Glynis, it's over. You can say it. And she looked around for a minute and then it dawned on her and she said, that's a wrap.
And they weren't, you weren't performing in front of these sets that we saw in the film when it was being filmed.
Well, the sets, the set pieces are there. For example, what you saw today with the caterpillar, he's on this very, very tall mushroom with his hookah, which is actually like your hospital pole that you would carry your IV pole. That's exactly what that is meant to look like. But the smoke rings weren't there. The butterflies on the flowers weren't there, but the flowers were there. So there were things we could see. I didn't know what the rabbit house looked like. I just turned around and looked like I'm looking at a rabbit house. So there were things we could see and things we were told that this is what we would be looking at.
Okay, and it's this high, so you're not looking, you're at the right height.
Yeah, it would be about here on this
Yeah.
on that screen, on that wall. The pictures in the Duchess's house where the Cheshire Cat comes. Like, it was fun to see that last night because I hadn't seen it before yesterday. And I was like, oh, look, there he is. There's Peter as the Cheshire Cat in that picture frame that I didn't know existed.
It's awesome. And was this your first time seeing this production, Elizabeth?
No,
Last night? Oh, you have seen it.
I saw it, yeah.
Good. I hope you liked it.
What's that?
I hope you liked it. I hope you
Oh,
enjoyed
I
it.
loved it. I absolutely loved it. I just couldn't get over the detail, the attention to detail, the perfection, everything, and your voice.
That's very
You know,
sweet.
you're right. Your voice is so wonderful.
You know, what I found really amazing, and I did write my colleagues last night, and I said, you know, the things that made me giggle when we were in rehearsals were still making me giggle. And so it was lovely to kind of relive that part of that rehearsal process and going, I remember when someone created that moment. That was so funny and so sweet, and it still made me laugh. So that was fun to kind of smile again over those things, aside from the moments when I'm going, my face is larger than I have ever wanted to see it.
I think everybody feels that way when you see yourself on it. Yes. And finally, I'd just like to say, the instrumentalists played pretty darn well, I thought, members of our symphony.
Well, they did. These are members of the Victoria Symphony, principally, and they too didn't have a lot of time. This is, of course, budgetary concerns, and you know, we can't afford always as much time as we'd like. But they were very attentive. They came well prepared. They were totally cooperative. And while there's some subtle and interesting things in the score, it's mercifully not too technically challenging, so that it was able to go together fairly promptly, and they get a sense of the idiom of it quite quickly, so that was pleasing.
Well, it's going to be a fantastic little run here in the Royal Theatre. Don't you all feel so nice just to be back in the Royal Theatre? And I'd like you to join me in thanking Elizabeth Raum, Tracy Dahl, and Timothy Vernon for joining us. And I'd like to thank you for joining us. We'll see you at the movies.